Hey, welcome everyone to Connected Learning TV.
Hey, welcome everyone to Connected Learning TV. Hey, welcome everyone to Connected Learning TV. Hey, welcome everyone.
Thanks for, I'm hearing an echo already. Thanks for joining us as we kick off a month-long partnership with the National Writing Project on writers at work making and connecting learning. And I'm Jeff Brazil. I work with the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub in Southern California, along with the crew at Connected Learning TV. And if you're watching on live stream, please, you can watch it there, or you can watch a recording. If you're also watching, you can watch a recording of the webinar later today. This conversation is part of our shift to a monthly format for deeper looks at individual themes and communities and topics. We started that in May with the YALSA, the Young Adult Library Service Association, and it's been a really good new format for us to go to. This month we're looking at an in-depth look at how the principles of connected learning provide a framework for innovation across different types of learning environments and context. And excited to have a great group here with us today. A few quick details before we dive in, sort of housekeeping. If you're on live stream right now, we really encourage you to use the chat that's there to introduce yourselves and connect with each other and post questions. For those of us that are in the Hangout, we'll pull those questions in as best we can, as fast as we can. And then on Google+, there's a really fast-growing connected learning community with over 1,800 members now, and we'd love for you to take a look at that, and that's something that you'd be interested in to join that as well. There's lots of daily postings and conversations, lots of opportunities there as well. And then finally, the link for our group, the public group notes should be in the live stream chat by now. And it's always awesome when people in the live stream can help us with taking notes and pulling out quotes and things that, or tagging resources, things that you think are important to be shared after the fact, after the Hangout. So appreciate your help on that as well. And as far as our group in the Hangout today, it's awesome to have who we have. And we'll start off with Eidman-Aadahl, who was going to sort of steer today's conversation on writing as making, making is writing. And Elise is the Director of National Programs and Site Development for the National Writing Project. She designs and facilitates networks for practitioners focused on the teaching of writing, digital literacy, and youth development. And really today's webinar kicks off a month-long focus at looking at writing and making with the National Writing Project. We're really excited to have them as a partner this month. And so Elise, maybe you could sort of start us off with explaining what NWP is and why we've chosen to focus this month of linking writing with making.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, Writing Project is really thrilled to be doing this partnership too with Connected Learning TV. So just as a frame, the National Writing Project is really a network of educators at all grade levels, all subject areas, K through university, and actually increasingly educators who work in the out-of-school space, maybe in libraries or museums or community-based learning settings for youth. And it's also, so it's a network of those great practitioners. It's also a network of local writing project sites, almost 200 of them, all across the country, a few of them abroad. And these are local organizations that are educator-led, and they really focus on supporting, we focus on working together as educators to kind of rethink our practice, taking up the notion of young people as writers and as producers. So if you put that sense of the young person as the productive agent at the center of your teaching practice, what does that mean for the way that you think about teaching and learning? So that's what we are. And I would say that also as educators, we really think that we too should be trying our own hand at writing, at making, at creating things to really keep that sense of what it's like to be a producer. So we have a lot of folks who are makers and who are writers. And actually, since we're doing this series of webinars in July, I want to give a shout out to both the people who are in Writing Project Summer Institutes right now. They are writing up a storm and kind of tapping that spark and that energy for themselves. You can see some of their postings at the National Writing Project G+ community. And also a whole bunch of folks that are in the Connected Learning MOOC right now, CL MOOC, who are also making up a storm. So I think that that's really part of the Summer of Making Connecting, which is a frame for this series as well. that all of us, educators too, can be makers and creators, as well as helping the young people we work with be makers and creators. So that's really us.
And so, Elise, the thing that, just to start us off then, and thank you for the introduction, could you start us off with sort of talking about how writing as making as a concept works? The connecting part seems more clear, but the writing as making and how that connects to the maker movement DIY stuff, that would be helpful.
Yeah, great, thanks. Well, right, when we think about writing as making, something we talk about in the National Writing Project a lot, people sometimes do get puzzled because the current maker movement, the DIY movement, really conjures up images of really tangible things, robots, mechanicals, 3D printing, things like that. And that's great. And one of the things the maker movement has really, I think, done is return a sense of the wonderful creative intelligence we have with our hands and with our bodies and creating and working with tangible things. But actually, really making a piece of writing, a publication, maybe a video, maybe audio, media making, those are also things that people make. These are made things. In fact, we kind of draw a line sometimes between making tangible things and digital stuff like the web, but the web is also a made thing. It's one of the reasons why Mozilla has a program they called Web Makers to really emphasize that these are made things. So these kinds of things, like writing, are things that people make. And like the DIY and maker movement right now, I think we share a couple of really important alliances and alignments. And one is this notion that we need to focus on creating and not just consuming. And I think that cuts across the maker community and the writing and media maker community. So, yes, for us in literacy, yes, we read. We want everyone to read, but we also want people to know you could be the writer of that book. We love it that people love film or listen to audio, but we want folks to know you could be the filmmaker, you could be the audio producer as well. So this notion that people are makers as well as consumers, and we need to actually keep that in balance, that's really, I think, what draws us together, the maker movement and the teaching of writing. And in fact, one of the most influential movements in the teaching of writing and media making really comes out of this recognition that when we make a piece of writing, when we are writing, we're making with craft something. And I hope we get to talk about that. I know a lot of people on this webinar are going to have ideas about that producing element of our work. So that'd be great to talk about.
All right, thanks for teeing that up. And speaking of everybody on the webinar, if we can just sort of start with introductions with the great group we have today, Andrew and Bud and Nicole. Let's start with you, Andrew, which you're on my left. I don't know if you're on everyone else's left, but you're on my left. Talk a bit about your organization and your work.
Sure. My name is Andrew Slawinski. I'm with DIY.org. DIY.org is a community for kids all over the world. Our focus is on allowing kids to follow their passions and basically facilitate their path into the things that they're incredibly interested in. And so we provide a skills platform, which is based on patches, but also basic sort of social media tools that are safe for parents and teachers that allow the kids to encourage each other, learn from each other, and push each other forward. So we really see, to Elise's point, we really see our goal as making the next generation of creators and producers. And so we see that through all different types of disciplines, whether that's animation or farming or writing or mathematics or technical skills. We really try to provide a platform that allows all of that to occur naturally and allow kids to really just like push themselves in a safe place. And so my real interest with talking about sort of what we do within the context of writing isn't so much the specific skills that we do with writing and journalism, but rather the way that the kids themselves within DIY.org use writing as a way as a way of spreading the news about what they're doing and sharing the specifics of their skills.
Thanks, Andrew. Bud?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Bud Hunt. I'm a teacher consultant with the Colorado State University Writing Project and an instructional technology coordinator with the St. Green Valley School District. And here today wearing my Center for Make Hack Play hat, which is a space that we're trying to build in our school district to help us better understand this, the makerspaces as learning spaces that aren't schools. What happens if we situate one in a school and it's partly a part of the school and it's partly not. And so we're trying to fiddle with that. But got into the Make Hack Play stuff as a direct result of this sort of line of writing and making being very close aligned. Also very fascinated in STEM and the things that happen when you say STEM in a school district right now. A lot of people's eyes light up and a lot of other people sort of just zone out. And what I think is really important about making and hacking and playing is these are sort of essential habits, writing too. And a lot of the work of STEM involves making and hacking and playing, and a lot of the work of the makers is making and hacking and playing, and a lot of the work of the writing and the social studies folks, I think, should be making and hacking and playing. So we're really trying to figure out how we promote sort of these habits across domains, across structures, across schools, and for us, writing is a very big component of that. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Really excited to be here.
Thanks, Bud. Nicole? Nicole, you there? Did we lose Nicole?
Oh no.
I think we did lose Nicole. Uh-oh. All right, she'll come back, I'm sure. So at least maybe we can just return to your comment about, maybe dive in, and then when Nicole comes back, we can talk a little bit to her. But your comment about being related to movements in the teaching of writing, and what does it mean to think of writing as part of a DIY movement? Sort of why that's significant, why that's important.
Okay, yeah, and I'm sure that we'll get Nicole in. She's just dialed out, and she'll probably dial in a second.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I think one of the things that's interesting is to think about some of the themes right now about the maker movement in general. And, you know, we have themes like how wonderfully centered, well, let's pause. Go ahead, she's back.
And I happen to be on a technology network at a university. That's not it. This is not my home network. So this is going to be fun. Yeah, so I think really trying to figure out what is the definition of literacy, and how do we need to think about the integration of spaces, technologies to enable youth to develop and also share. So that's who I am, and that's what we do.
All right, thanks, Nicole, for braving the interruptions over there. All right, Elise, back to you.
So these themes in the maker movement, just to name a couple, and then let everybody sort of locate themselves in them. In the current maker movement, there are a couple of things that you hear people talk about again and again and again that I think are so important. One is this real emphasis on wonderful, passion-driven amateur activity. Amateur in the sense of doing it for love, the original sense of the term. And people talk a lot about maker culture and maker spaces having low floors and high ceilings. Low floors in the sense that you can get into them pretty easily. The low barrier of entry also comes up. But high ceilings, you can sort of take what you're working on, even from an amateur level, to a really wonderful professional and deep level. But you don't have to wait to participate. You can come in and participate in a passion-driven way, interest-driven way right from the start. So they're also participatory. There's different ways that people can operate in the space, things they can start doing. You don't have to sit on the sidelines. You can sit and watch a little bit before you dive in, but you don't have to. You can get inducted into a participatory culture. And people also talk about the strong interest in craft, in the very best sense, not in a low sense of technique or something like that, but in a kind of rich sense of being able to learn about the craft of things that you're making. So all of those things, I think, transfer very, very much to the field of writing. And just to kind of make those parallels, I think, a little bit clearer, in the field of writing, for ourselves at the National Writing Project, we started in 1974, and I think that at that moment you can see a similar kind of cultural moment. And the theme at that point was actually that writers are made, not born. And if you think about all the images we have of the writer as a kind of highly gifted person and the thing they write sort of coming out of their mind full-formed in some sense, special person that is a writer. At the time that our organization began, that was really being remade to this notion that actually anyone could be that writer, and that it's a process of starting to work with writing, starting to work on the craft, that makes somebody a writer. So this notion that you're a writer is made, not born, you could imagine translates. An engineer is made, not born. An architect is made, not born. A computer programmer is made, not born. A lot of things that we have associated with a sort of innate brilliance actually are the result of a lot of hard work and sometimes really wonderful work of becoming that person. So that parallel really was influential for us at the National Writing Project, and I'd name just quickly 3 things that we can then kind of play with in the webinar. One is a sense of identity that you can become. You can start to think of yourself as a writer, and then, gosh darn it, you can go write. There's an identity shift that you might go through that's really connected to that notion that no one has to tell you you're a writer. No one has to bless you as a writer. You can just start writing. You can develop an identity. Also, the fact that writing is work, and I think we'll come back to that a lot because the maker movement kind of dignifies the actual work of tinkering and building and creating. And I think similarly in writing, dignifying the work, draft by draft, of iterating and creating is part of this movement in writing as well. And the third thing I'd name is this notion that if it is work, if it is craft, maybe the tools and the space that go along with doing that craft are something you need access to. And I'd name then kind of the workshop, the work in the workshop. And all the way back to that period of time in the 70s and into the early 80s, something that got called the process movement comes up a lot. And it really refers in some ways to that kind of craft culture that I think is very much like the current makerspace. There were lots of things like, and this is sort of at the end of the 60s into the 70s, things like the Paris Review interviews, a famous, relatively famous magazine where authors were interviewed about their craft and they talked about the work. This novel, this play didn't write itself. What did I do draft by draft? What was the work? There were really important books in the field of the teaching of writing, like I'll just name one name from the past, Donald Murray, whose book, A Writer Teaches Writing, kind of captures that. I'm a writer, here's what I do, here's how I teach others to do the craft as well. Or Peter Elbow, another name from that period of time. He had a book, Writing Without Teachers, which I think is also interesting and significant, that talks about the way that circles of writers can help each other. You don't have to be taught. You can meet with other colleagues, you can have a peer network, and you can learn to write in this collegial way. And here are some techniques that writers' circles, writer peer groups might use in order to improve their writing. So since that period of time, there have been lots of arguments in the field of writing. People debate all kinds of things, but I think that regardless of where you'd see those names now, that there's probably no one in the teaching of writing who wouldn't say that this basic concept that anybody sitting in front of you could be a writer isn't at the very core of what we do. So that identity piece. And then finally, back to that craft and writer's workshop, there's a whole long tradition of workshop teaching in the teaching of writing and in journalism and other kinds and media making that basically says rather than having a kind of environment where the teacher should just lecture at people about what writing is, we need to convert this environment, this classroom or this space, into the workplace where writing happens. a kind of purpose-built environment for writing, and that's the Writers' Workshop. Communities of writers can be meeting there, can create a workshop together. You can introduce tools into it. If you think about the importance of tools in publishing and circulating content, creating new kinds of content, this kind of purpose-built space for writing and learning to write, I think also has a lot to do with how we're seeing the maker movement now, makerspaces and new medias and learning labs and other purpose-built spaces for production. So I think those are some examples of how there are traditions across these movements, and these have a lot of resonance now when people talk about not just writing and media making, but the arts, the craft traditions, digital fabrication. I think there are analogies between the 3D printer, for example, what that lets you do, and the computer that lets you all of a sudden kind of create your own movie in a way that you couldn't do before the tools were cheap and accessible and available even to amateurs. So some of those themes I think we'd love to explore here in the webinar with all the guests, Jeff, because I think there's actually some things that we can teach each other about these styles of teaching that have grown up at slightly different historic times, but maybe point the way out of some dilemmas that we have in education, some ways that we want to really rethink what happens for young people and actually for learners of all types. So, say that.
No, thank you for setting all of that up. As I listened to you and as I was thinking about the topic for the month, and especially today, I have a question. Why is it useful to connect writing to DIY maker movement? So very personally, my grandfather owned the largest dairy farm in Hawaii, and to me, he was the original DIYer. On his dairy farm, he could transform anything on that farm into just about anything else. And that goes back, 100 years or so. So I think about DIY before it was sort of known as DIY or the maker, and then I think about writing as separately. So is there something about our times or today's generation that is important to connect those two? What is the usefulness in connecting those?
Probably everybody on the webinar might have a slightly different take on that, but I think one of the challenges for writing right now is that spirit, that tinkering spirit, which you see so much in the makerspace and which is thriving outside of schools, in many ways is the spirit that leads young writers and media makers to kind of great, wonderful acts of ambition and passion-driven learning. And in some ways, writing suffers, I would say, from being so often a tool of evaluation and judgment. Not that it has to be, but especially I think for young makers and creators in schools, most of what they experience now in writing is that writing is connected to testing, writing is connected to the performance you need to do in school to move ahead. And so that spirit that actually writing should belong to the writer and the reader, that's a little different transaction than the teacher and the student, is there, I think, deeply in the creative play that you see in the maker movement. And there's no reason why that spirit can't inform the way that writing happens and media creation happens as well. So I think capturing that energy for the kinds of making that also are academically useful would be really important on the writing side. And I think the other side is there are a lot of people looking at the maker movement now and trying to imagine how really powerful, let's say, academic outcomes in STEM or other things could happen. So actually how I think the writing community has had to navigate that question for a while about the academic and career importance of writing, but also trying to maintain some sense of authenticity and connection with the learning and doing of writing. And I think that's something that actually would be a great conversation with the proponents of making who want to figure out how to navigate that as well.
What does everybody else think? Andrew, Bud, Nicole? This connection, with the value of the connection of the two.
I think it makes a lot of sense insofar as like when you create environments, particularly within academic settings, where kids are starting to connotate things like traditional STEM skills and writing with work, and not work in the sense of something that they love to do, but work in the sense of something that they're obligated to do. And oftentimes, like, the reason why that suffers is that it lacks a context, right? Like, why am I taking this standardized test? I don't understand how this applies to me. And so what we find so often, at least in my work, whether it's been starting makerspaces or starting hackerspaces or working in DIY.org, is that if you can provide a meaningful context for writing and STEM skills, all of a sudden these things just take on a life of their own. Like, I think talking about, like, getting back to Elisa's point about thinking about the maker movement within a historical context, like, one of my favorite historical periods to or historical movements to go back on is to look at the arts and crafts movement, which was popular within Great Britain and the United States in the early 1900s. And one of my favorite quotes is actually from William Morris, and it's, "Art is man's joy in labor." And I think what's really important about that is that if you can allow kids to inject their own passions into the things that they're doing, art happens naturally. And the path towards mastery is not so much about a path of training and sort of rigor, as much as it is about a path that's based on the love of something that you're doing. And I think relative to writing, that's always going to come out of any craft discipline, like whether your passion is the act of writing itself and the craft of writing itself, or the craft of becoming a great computer programmer, or the craft of becoming the best at Minecraft or whatever. Writing is often a byproduct of that. And so I think what I'm really interested in is building up tools and pathways to allow that to occur.
This is Nicole. I had so whatever I had planned to say today, I think has been completely thrown out of the window with some provocative things that y'all all talked about. And one of them, I just have a question around the notion between, when I think of writing, I think of part of the reason people write is for an audience. And I think of, when we think of media movement, I think a lot of what we've seen about youth wanting to develop their proficiency and skill set in creating media has to do with audience, because they want to be seen, and there's tools to do that. And I'm curious, in the maker movement, as I think about how much is it about creating for an audience, or is it about creating for self? And I'm, because I'm not, I don't, when I know youth who are doing making stuff, but I don't know how much the focus for them is to actually share out with others. And so that's an interesting question as I think about the identity, the question of identity and what develops, what is the marker of helping someone feel like their identity is being developed as they're developing as a writer, as a media producer, and as a maker. And I hadn't really thought about the role. I've always thought about the role of audience in terms of media making and writing, but I hadn't actually really thought about it in terms of maker. And I'm just curious what those of you in the maker movement, where audience plays a role, besides let me share it up like in Instructables, but truly from the motivation for creating. I'm sorry, Jeff, if I just took it completely to a different...
No. As you were talking, I was thinking about the messages I see periodically from teachers who are encouraging their kids to write on their blogs and to do blogging. And they're saying, hey, our kids are blogging and they would love comments. So it's to your point about you're encouraging the writing and the blogging, but is it just for the love of the writing, or is it actually for the audience? And that becomes important to the kids and the youth, right? Mm-hmm. But maybe this is something you're wrestling with as well.
Yeah, one of the strange things that we've seen at DIY is that kids have started their own newspapers to help spread the word about the work that they're doing within these little sub-communities that happen. And it's very much so based on identity, exactly like you're saying. one of the things that's really interesting is that like we have a lot of short form writing, like comments like, hey, that's cool, exclamation point, or emojis increasingly. So it's like pizza, pizza, smiley face. But I think like one of the biggest things is that if you give a kid, particularly within different age groups, like when you're becoming a tween, right? Like at 11, 12, 13-year-olds, you're really trying to carve out your identity in the world. And a lot of that's based on the things that you're passionate about. So if you can provide a safe space where a kid can feel enabled to just completely geek out about the things that they're passionate about, no matter how esoteric they may be, and then provide them a way to communicate their identity, then all of a sudden those two pieces can fit together. Like they'll start to communicate out because they want to share their identity, but they also feel safe to embrace the actual the sort of inner craft that they're excited about.
So I want to jump in a little bit because I think that this idea of audience is always really interesting to me, both as a writer and as somebody who makes other stuff. And what I'm finding as I talk to Makerspace folks and people in those communities is we're trying to figure out how to make our spaces, anyway. The thing that comes back is like a lot of these audiences that we think of sometimes as a student, and particularly blogging is an example I spend a lot of time with. Oh, the world is our potential audience now. But in making it seems like it's a smaller, closer audience, right? Like here are the 5 people that I feel like I'm willing to share my amazing passion with, particularly in that teenage age. But I think it's important to think about 2 types of making or writing that goes on in a makerspace, or at least that I think does or should, because they lend themselves to different audiences. So there's the product, right? There's the thing that I'm going to make, and that might be the essay or the poem or the movie or the robot or the circuit board or the shirt or whatever. But there's also all the process writing, like the note taking, the remembering, the stuff, and that your audience there is totally different. Your audience in that process is oftentimes just you. Oh man, what did I do yesterday? What was the LED? What was the resistance that I needed so I didn't set things on fire? You know, like that's a very different sort of thing. But when I write in those spaces, you know, I've got my little awesome notebook that the only person who may ever see that is me, but it's really important that I communicate the right thing to myself in those. So I guess I'm answering the audience question, but I'm trying to go back to that other question of where is writing in the place of making. And I guess I just want to say that it seems to me like writing is hidden on the process side of making. And I want to bring that out and sort of shine some lights on it. There's a great passage in the book. It's a book about Bell Labs called The Innovation. I'll find it in a minute. But it talks about the time that this new scientist gets his first notebook at Bell Labs. And it's this leather, gold inlaid notebook. And it's this big deal that he's getting the notebook. And by the way, if he doesn't write down everything and get a second signature, there's problems with the patents later, and his supervisor will fire him and all this stuff. But like the presentation of the official notebook at Bell Labs is like it's magic. And I think moments like that should be in our maker spaces too, where we say to our students and our colleagues, like, here, this is important that you pay attention and take good notes along the way of your making. And I want to figure out how we bring that out in the makerspace too.
You know, I'm thinking too, Nicole's really great question that linked back to identity, and I think, you know, identity is something we make over time, and I can think of many times in a makerspace or even just play at home or something like that, where the young person sort of holds something up to a respected other, a parent, an older sibling, or whatever, and just says, "Look what I did! Look what I made!" And sort of that moment is a huge moment for the maker, but it's also a huge moment for the adults that surround that person. Are you going to sort of celebrate that first attempt and let somebody start to make an identity as capable and along a path? Or are you going to notice all the ways that it's a mess? Because it probably, if you look at the ultimate product in terms of function, it probably does have a long way to go, but celebrating that step, that, hey, look at me moment, with a young person or with anybody trying to learn a new skill, I think is really huge. There's a piece that's around the confidence in capacity that I think is linked to the hard work of iteration. There was a question about revision. I think lots of people in writing and in media making would talk about how hard it is to teach and work with revision, but that's actually where a lot of the learning to write happens. A lot of where the iteration around a technical effect or a new draft of something in media making happens. And you need to have a kind of competence and capacity to continue through that process. And little by little, as you grow in your skills, learn to do that more effectively with a greater chance, likelihood of a positive outcome to persist. Somebody in the, Terry Elliott in the CL MOOC talked about intelligence persistence through iteration in a little discussion about not being so fearful of failing, but understanding that failure of something is part of a process, and you actually work through it to something that is more satisfying to you and maybe more effective with your audience in writing, or more effective for the function. In a way, there's in the maker movement, you could say there's a function that I'm trying to create, and I can watch this thing, and if it collapses or if it holds up or performs its function, that's a test of concept, just like meeting an audience is a test of concept for writers.
One thing that's been helpful for me, writing-wise, that I've learned from my coder friends is the idea of bugs. That bugs are not a problem. They're expected to be part of the process. And so actually some lights went on for me on this question of revision, because it's painful for me to work through different revisions, to think that I did something not quite right. It just was not a good way of thinking about it. And the coding friends that I have are like, hey, that's just part of the whole deal. And it has really helped me to work to that revision question that we had.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry. I think that relates back to what Bud was saying as well. There's actually, I'm an engineer by trade, and so it's always really funny to kind of think about this idea of revision. Like, one thing that the engineering discipline does pretty well is that A, we always expect bugs, but B, we also document every single thing that we do. And so when we make 1,000 revisions to a piece of code, like, it all happens out in the open. Like, we're all sharing that in source control. You can't hide your mistakes from anyone. And so with that comes this great leveling. Like, it doesn't matter how good you are. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody introduces bugs. Everybody fixes bugs. And we all kind of do it out in the open and together. And I think that, like, the opening of the process, whether that's the revision process or the iteration process, or just like the actual process of becoming good at a craft, is just rooted in just endless cycles of revision. I think there's a lot of power in opening up that entire process. And I think, like, some of that is being reiterated by engineering communities like GitHub, right? Where you have, you know, arguably one of the largest collections of work, of human work ever, is out in the open. And there's a tremendous amount of power and a tremendous amount of community building that can happen around sharing all of the process of work. And I think that that's, like, a really interesting thing to try to bring to education, that sort of way of thinking about revision, not as oh, you made a mistake, but just as a part of life.
And just to add to that also, I'm a computer scientist, and I've always felt that while I thought coding and writing were similar, the piece that always seemed where they differed is the instantaneousness of feedback. And that when I'm coding, I'm constantly checking my work to see what my understanding is, it running, where the problems are, and you look forward to, in some sense, a bug. If you want to view it, I don't actually even think of it as a bug in some sense, because it's just, to me, a sign of where I need to go next. And I've always thought with writing, it was more like you might work for weeks and months before you actually got some feedback. And so I thought where I thought coding is closer to gameplay, in that games you get the feedback more instantaneously in terms of, and then that keeps you in your seat because you want to get to the next level. And so for us, it's been trying to figure out, well, how do you make writing the creation of media? How do you get that feedback process happening more often, such that users are constantly iterating on their work? as opposed to thinking that, okay, I submitted, it's done, and that I shouldn't be necessarily iterating.
Yeah, Nicole, with your work, for example, in Digital Youth Network, it feels to me like there's a role that that the mentors play that you might want to describe in terms of both sort of feedback, but then also an image of what it's like to work at a higher level. What is what is it like to do the work in a professional context, or other kinds of things that youth can see through the mentors? I wonder if you could talk about that a little.
Right, yeah, so we've structured DYN, and also the work at UMedia is structured in a model where you have youth who are showcasing and sharing their work with each other, with their peers. And over time, we've been fortunate to have almost like very much a layering, a leveling, where you have beginners, you have youth who are at varying levels of work, but then you also have professional mentors who in their day job, they're teaching youth and mentoring, but in their, after 5 or 6, they're professional artists, and they're actually still gigging in whatever their gig might be. And so they bring a studio style perspective into the classroom, but at the core of that is the sharing of your work at different phases, and getting feedback, and being first willing to put your work out there to elicit feedback from others, and being able to hear and take in that feedback with the assumption that you're going to iterate and make it better, and that in order to reach certain types of audiences or certain types of performance spaces where your work might be viewed at the class level, but maybe it makes it to the city level, or maybe even it makes it on the stage with John Legend. John Legend. That would really be a technical with John Legend, you really, that product has been iterated on so many times and reached a level of quality. And so by making the act of sharing and learning from each other's work and being open to feedback from mentors who you respect because you actually see their work, I think you create this sort of endless ecosystem and cycle where the work has gone through so many phases that I don't even know if a kid knows, like, this is version 1, this is version 2, this is version 3. It's more so that it's been iterated on all these different times.
Andrew, could you talk about how you guys approach the badges for writing and making and media production, and what kind of badges you have and how you think about that?
Sure. Yeah, so we have I think we're nearing 100 different badges right now for all different subjects. We actually, if I screen share, it might actually help a little bit here. So we really separate our skills out into like these different disciplines, and we sort of have like a vague taxonomy that's very fluid, and also very much so based on the kids when they actually ask us for different subjects. But we split things into kind of artist, builder, farmer, scientist, engineer, and hacker, and there's a lot of shades of gray in between all of those different subjects. And currently it looks something like this. So we're still obviously very, very much so still building out the taxonomy system. But within skills on DIY, there is this idea of sort of earning a skill and sort of taking your first step into a skill. And then we also have a concept of mastery. So let's just go to the camper skill. And one of the biggest things that we do is, like what I always like to say is that when a kid earns their patch, when they sort of take their first step, it's because they've completed 3 challenges towards that skill. And my goal with that moment when they've earned that skill patch is that I want that to be the moment at which they're no longer afraid of that subject. So if it's circuit bending, I want that to be the moment at which they're no longer afraid of burning themselves with the soldering iron, or afraid of frying a piece of electronics, that they understand the risks and that they feel comfortable with it. And then we have a second phase where once they've kind of passed that point, we encourage them to master the skill. And we use a lot of these kind of, I guess what you would consider sort of more traditional terms like mastery and, you know, we don't use the word apprenticeship, but it's very much so kind of based along those ideas of you're on a journey towards mastery. And we really try to just structure things in a way so that we're constantly putting new things in front of you that you can try if you ever get stuck. So for the camper skill, for example, you know, we have all of these different challenges, whether that's travel a trail or make a mound campfire, pack your backpack, build a shelter in the wild. And kids actually will document their process of creating and making these things and then submit it. And each one is reviewed, and then if it's approved, they earn their, you know, tick towards that skill. And so in the documentation process, sort of circling back to what we were just talking about before, there is a lot of sort of opportunity for writing. So kids will comment on each other's projects, but kids will also often, particularly if they're extroverted, they want to write a lot to be able to share with kids how they actually accomplish the feat. And a lot of that actually happens after the project is completed. If kids are interested in the project, they'll actually say, hey, can you tell me how you made that? Like, what was your cooking recipe? Or, you know, where did you find that part? That sort of thing. And a lot of that sociality, while it is monitored by all of DIY staff, and we also have a lot of technology in place to help keep that safe, we try to give kids a really long leash and allow them to form these social interactions and allow them to form these little subcultures. Like, you know, we have the Minecraft kids, and then we have the kids that are super into cooking, and then we have the kids that are super into skateboarding, and then we have the kids that are super into making duct tape wallets. Like, there are sort of infinite subcultures on DIY, and a lot of that sort of relates back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of identity. And we really see it as our job to be able to allow kids to form these subcultures and feel incredibly comfortable and empowered to just be themselves. So that's what we're doing.
Thank you, Andrew. Level 3 is did I hear you right that level 3 is when the fear is gone?
Yeah, after their third challenge, the way that we try to structure everything, like our goal is after they complete 3 challenges, that's the moment at which I want them to not be afraid anymore. And it's a little bit of a lofty goal, but it helps in terms of product design and approach, how we actually design and structure all the curriculum.
Okay, I think I'm at 2.5 on that.
You know, now, Jeff, I'm glad that you prompted Andrew to talk about the badge/patch system at DIY, because I think another place, back to your early question, what do these movements have to learn from each other? I think that folks whose work happens in schools, Bud might talk a little bit about this a little later, have a lot of models that we can look at of how assessment and feedback in a positive way is being accessed by people in out-of-school contexts. So the youth that are going through challenges in DIY are actually getting a lot of feedback. There's actually what we could call an assessment system. You know you're leveling up. This happens in games. This happens in a bunch of places. It's constructed differently, and it's actually constructed in a space where young people will walk with their feet out of the environment if it doesn't work for them. And we can say the same thing happens in schools in a different way, that young people walk mentally or sometimes with their actual feet as well when assessment doesn't work for them. But by looking at some of these other environments that are actually valuing feedback and assessment and how they're designing them, I think that could be really illuminating. It sort of opens up this huge dilemma for writing. Both Bud and Andrew talked about kind of the naturally occurring writing that happens in the context of real work. And if you think about when you write in a kind of classic assessment moment on a, let's say, a short answer test or something like that, you see how absolutely distorted that writing situation is. You're a person who knows less about your subject probably than the assessor. You're writing quickly, probably without much draft or preparation. You're encouraged not to get too involved in your topic because you won't have enough time to actually follow any thread to your own satisfaction. You're going to write something for someone who's going to look at the ways that you fail to achieve kind of the ideal piece. And that is such an unnatural reading and writing situation. We don't go like to the bookstore to look up a magazine because we know more about this topic than the writer of the article so that we can sit there and judge them. We actually go often and buy something where the author has some authority over the subject. We're reading to learn something. It's the exact inverse of that assessment-driven writing. So in some senses, the more recent, especially standardized assessment, the kind of assessment we see with current reform movements, has created more minutes, I think, of unnatural writing and fewer minutes of the kind of studio environment that everybody on this webinar talked about, where we help each other with projects so that the project can get better. Not get better as a school piece of writing, but as something that's actually really maybe going to go out and meet an audience. That's an entirely different situation. It's a different situation for making. The studio environment, the notion of making something for the world, that's a great tradition in writing that we have to fight for, I think, because it's not the same as writing to score well in assessments. Every minute that pushes that out of classrooms, I think is, robs some young people, maybe the young people who need that the most because they may not have it elsewhere, from the opportunity to experience, really, the authority that an author has in writing. I think in some ways, but I'm guessing that when you talk about sort of inside of school and outside of school, both for Center for Make Hack Play, it's kind of trying to walk some of those boundaries.
It is in two ways. I mean, one way, and I'm nodding my head a lot at what you're saying because this is where we're thinking. I mean, in some ways, we want to capture the kids who are wandering off to do really interesting stuff outside of school and say, hey, can you show us what you're doing? That's really great. I mean, we want to create those spaces, in part for the people that don't have access to them other places, but in part because as an educational institution, I think we're supposed to serve the people in the boundary, to help them learn stuff and things. But we also think that there's a lot to learn from makers that would help us better do our jobs as educators. So you talked about some assessments and different pathways and different models. I mean, one of the things we hope to do in our space is to use it as a professional development space for teachers to expose them to some of these situations. My hunch is, and we don't know this for sure yet, but my hunch is we'll discover that there's some kids that are quite adept in a makerspace who probably aren't walking into the third period literature classroom or the math room and saying, I'm so good at school and this is where I thrive, right? And I want to capture those experiences of young people being successful in those other spaces to show to the teachers and say, look, this child is not flawed, very curious, very passionate, things are going on. How do we work with that in our classroom? And what are the things that are happening here that could be vice versa? I think about it as sort of a space of cross-pollination, right? I want to take the best of what's going on in the classroom and the best of what's going on out of school and see what mingles and goes together and what we can learn from that. And I think there's an awful lot that we can learn.
We're about 6 minutes from the top of the hour, and I wanted to give everyone a chance to sort of have any sort of final thoughts. Also, the live stream chat has been fantastic. There's lots of great shares and thoughts in there. But at least before we do that, I wanted to ask, sort of, so zooming out, how did these sort of ideas of writing and making inhabit some of the thinking and the principles of the connected learning? How does that work in your mind?
Yeah. Oh, thank you for bringing that up. And we really hope that people will actually take this month too to use this as an opportunity to really dive into the connected learning principles. I think a lot of us, certainly in the National Writing Project, have been looking at them. I think it's part of what Bud's been thinking about in thinking about the Center for Make Hack Play. The connected learning principles are a set of design principles that we can use to kind of look at any educational learning situation and environment and maybe set for ourselves some targets of some things we might want to remix, some ways we might want to push an environment or a practice. And you can really see when you look at them how writing and media creation could really fit in the center. It's production driven. We can leverage our peer culture, our great connections with others in a way of doing and learning to write. We certainly can see that there are powerful potential academic or career or civic outcomes. So in a way, you can look at writing, you can map writing as something that could be at the center of a kind of connected learning practice. But often it isn't. And one of the things that I think we want to think about when we look at connected learning is how a kind of recommitment to the power of writing, and by that I also mean media making and creating with audio and image, how that can really be at the center of providing a way for young people to find an interest and follow it through to a more important outcome, a more ambitious thing. We talk a lot, we care a lot in connected learning about interest drivenness, and everybody on this webinar has talked about interest, the power of interest. And we sometimes don't always know what to do with interest, but actually a creative writing and media project, creative, critical, interest-driven, can be a long path that somebody can follow, that a learner can follow to an outcome that is kind of rich and ambitious and can make its way into the world. And that vision could animate some thinking for educators about how we could make space for that. We have a lot of writing and media creation that's sort of one-off, that's relatively shallow. A lot of our environments ask people to sort of go only so far, and then we're on to the next topic and the next topic and the next topic. And we don't have to do everything in depth, but we could look at our environments in school or out of school and say, where do young people who have a passion and want to follow it through to a deep conclusion, where would they do that in our environment? And how could we coach them, support them, mentor them, create an environment for them to go deep with something they care about? I'm guaranteeing that they will learn really important academic, career, and civic skills along the way, but they'll do it because the writing allowed them to follow an interest and a passion.
I'm tempted to pick up a question from the live stream that asks, or that makes, that there's a comment in there about how writers have a lot to learn from the Maker Geeked Out community. I do wonder if there's a vice versa, or is it at this point in time, is that, would you all nod in agreement with that? There's just a ton to learn writing wise from the Make.
Totally.
It's two-way street. I mean, there's a lot to learn in a lot of places, and we're in a hurry to segmentize a lot of it when I wish we would do more celebrating and figuring out what the stuff is that works well together.
Yeah, I think that's right on. Like, there's so much that I actually wish that the maker community would embrace from the writing community as well, though. I think like the discipline that the writing community sort of holds so high is something that the maker community is actually really struggles with, and I think that that's a tremendous value that the other side needs to embrace. And then, yeah, likewise, I think that there's a lot of interesting tools that the maker community brings to the table and sort of brings to the way in which they sort of experience the world and build their crafts that I think writing could also embrace. But it's definitely a two-way street, and I think Bud's exactly right. I think we spend too much time segmenting between communities.
Yeah, that sounds exactly right, and it's a good note to end on, even though the live stream chat is like super animated. So lots of great thoughts that we were not able to get to in the Hangout. So thank you, Andrew and Bud, especially you, Elise, for this month partnership. We're looking really forward to it. And again, the chat has been awesome, and I want to remind people that later today, probably by this evening time, Pacific, if not Eastern, we will have a full recording of the webinar up on the site, and the chat and everything will be preserved. All the links, everything that was mentioned today, all the great comments and quotes will be there. So please don't forget that. And so this sort of wraps up sort of week one in this month-long focus on writing and making. And I want to encourage everyone to keep things going by using the Twitter hashtags CLMOOC, CLMOOC, and the second one, connected learning. So hashtag CLMOOC, hashtag connected learning. And by posting also in the connected learning Google Plus community. Also, it is not too late, I know Elise would want me to mention, to join the Making Learning Connected Google Plus community too, and check out Educator Innovator, and check out Summer of Making Connecting. There's lots of wonderful chaos taking place, as far as I can tell, but it's beautiful. So check those things out. Tomorrow, July 3rd, from 10 to 11 a.m. Pacific time, we will revisit today's conversation and enhance it and grow on it with some of the ideas that came out of today's conversation via Twitter using the hashtag literacies. And then finally, next Tuesday, a week from today, 10 to 11 a.m. Pacific time, was getting to at the end there, and how we as adults, how adults can support youth in pursuing their interests and their passions. And then finally, check out connectedlearning.tv for any more information on all the events happening this month, how to get involved. There's just a ton of great stuff happening. Summer is here, but the learning is definitely not stopped. So a ton of community and learning stuff for you to take advantage of. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Go write something or make something.
Bye.
Bye.